The early Middle Ages, feudalism and the church. Charlemagne was crowned emperor of the Romans in 800 BCE. After Charlemagne's death, his successors were too weak to maintain law and order under the face of invasions by Vikings, Muslims, and Magyars. People needed protection for themselves, their homes, and their lands. In response to this basic need for protection, a new system evolved, known as feudalism. Feudalism was a loosely organized system of rule in which powerful local lords divided their land holdings among lesser lords. In exchange, these lesser lords or vassals pledged service and loyalty to the greater lord. The relationship between lords and vassals was established by custom and tradition and by an exchange of pledges known as a feudal contract. A lord granted his vassal a fief or estate. Fiefs reigned from a few acres to hundreds of square miles. In addition to the land itself, the fief included peasants to work the land, as well as any towns or buildings on the land. As part of the feudal contract, the lord promised to protect his vassal. In return, the vassal pledged loyalty to his lord. He also agreed to provide the lord with 40 days of military service each year, certain money payments, and advice. Everyone had a place in feudal society. Below the monarch were the powerful lords, such as dukes and counts, who held the largest fiefs. Each of these lords had vassals, and these vassals in turn had their own vassals. In many cases, the same man was both vassal and lord. Vassal to a more powerful lord above him, and lord to a less powerful vassal below him. Because vassals often held fiefs for more than one lord, feudal relationships grew very complex. A vassal who had pledged loyalty to several lords could have serious problems if his overlords quarreled with each other. What was he to do if they both demanded his aid? To solve this problem, a vassal usually had a lineage lord to whom he owed his first loyalty. The manor was the lord's estate. During the Middle Ages, the manor system was the basic economic arrangement. The manor system rested on a set of rights and obligations between a lord and his serfs. The lord provided the serfs with housing, farmland, and protection from bandits. In return, serfs tended the lord's land, cared for his animals, and performed other tasks to maintain the estate. Peasant women shared in the farm work with their husbands. All peasants, whether free or serf, owed the lord certain duties. These included at least a few days of labor each week and a certain portion of their grain. The manor was a self-contained world, and peasants rarely traveled more than 25 miles from their own manor. By standing in the center of a plowed field, they could see their entire world at a glance. A manor usually covered only a few square miles of land. During the early Middle Ages, the Church's most important achievement was to Christianize the diverse peoples of Western Europe. In 597, Pope Gregory I sent Augustine to convert the Anglo-Saxons in England. From Britain, later missionaries went back to the continent to spread their faith among Germanic tribes. Women also spread their faith, even at the risk of their own lives. Some women married pagan kings and brought their husbands into the church. Clotilde, for example, persuaded her husband Clovis, who was the king of the Franks, to accept Christianity. In manor villages, the priest of the parish or local region was the only contact people had with the church. The priest cared for the souls of his parishioners by celebrating the Mass and by administering the sacraments, the sacred rites of the church. Christians believed that faith in Christ and participation of the sacraments would lead them to salvation or everlasting life with God. In addition to administering the sacraments, priests preached the Gospels and the teachings of the Church. They guided people on issues regarding values and morality. They offered assistance to the sick and needy. Christian rituals and faith were part of the fabric of everyday life. Peasants were married by priests, and nobles baptized their children and buried the dead in the sacred ground of the church. The church was a social center as well as a place of worship. After services, peasants gossiped or danced, although the priests might condemn their rowdy songs or behavior. In the later Middle Ages, some parish priests ran schools. Villages took pride in their church buildings and decorated them with care. In later medieval times, prosperous communities built stone churches rather than wooden ones. Some churches housed relics or remains of martyrs or other holy figures. Local people, as well as visitors, might make pilgrimages or journeys to pray before the relics. To support themselves and the parishes, the church required Christians to pay a tithe or a tax equal to 1/10 of their income. The tithe had its origins in the Bible. Tithing is still common in many Christian churches today. Daily life revolved around the Christian calendar, which marked holy days such as Easter, in addition to changes in the seasons. In medieval times, many holidays were added to the calendar to honor saints. The church taught that men and women were equal before God, but on earth women were viewed as daughters of Eve, weak and easily led into sin. Thus, they needed the guidance of men. At the same time, the church offered a view of the ideal woman as pure and modest as Mary, the mother of Jesus. Many churches were dedicated to the Mother of God and the Queen of Heaven. Men and women asked Mary to pray to God on their behalf. The church tried to protect women. It set a minimum age for marriage. Church courts could find men who seriously injured their wives, yet they often punished women more harshly than men for the same offense. During the early Middle Ages, both men and women withdrew from worldly life to become nuns and monks. Behind the walls of monasteries and convents, they devoted their lives to spiritual goals. Around 1530, a monk named Benedict organized the monastery of Monte Cassino in southern Italy. He drew up a set of rules to regulate monastic life. In time, the Benedictine rule was used by monasteries and convents across Europe. Under the Benedictine rule, monks and nuns took 3 vows. The first was obedience to the abbot or abbess who headed the monastery or convent. The second was poverty, and the third was chastity or purity. Each day was divided into periods for worship, work, and study. Benedict believed that in the spiritual value of manual labor, so he required monks to work in the fields and at other physical tasks. As part of their labor, monks and nuns cleared and drained land and experimented with crops. In a world without hospitals or schools, monasteries and convents often provided basic services. Monks and nuns looked after the poor and sick and sometimes set up schools for children. They gave food and lodging to travelers, especially to Christian pilgrims traveling to holy shrines. Some monks and nuns eventually became missionaries. For example, St. Patrick was a monk who set up the Irish Church. Later, the Church honored many missionaries by declaring them saints. Monasteries and convents also performed a vital role in preserving the writings of the ancient world. Often monks and nuns copied ancient works as a form of labor. Once copied, the work might remain unread for centuries. Still, it would be there when later scholars took an interest in ancient learning. Educated monks and nuns kept learning alive. Although women could not become priests, many did enter convents. There, women could escape the limits of society. In the later Middle Ages, the Church put more restrictions on nuns. It withdrew rights that nuns had once enjoyed, such as preaching the gospel, and placed most independent convents under the control of church officials. It didn't like too much learning for women, preferring them to accept church authority. Although women's role within the church was limited, they made valuable contributions to their faith. In the centuries after the fall of Rome, the Church carved out a unique position in Western Europe. It not only controlled the spiritual life of Christians, but gradually became the most popular secular or worldly force in medieval Europe. During the Middle Ages, the Pope was the spiritual leader of the Roman Catholic Church. As representatives of Christ on earth, medieval popes eventually claimed papal supremacy or authority over secular rulers like kings or political leaders. The Pope headed an army of churchmen who supervised church activities. High clergy, such as bishops and archbishops, were usually nobles. Like other feudal lords, some had their own territories. The Pope himself held vast lands in central Italy, later called the Papal States. Church officials were closely linked to secular rulers. Because churchmen were often the only educated people, feudal rulers appointed them to high government positions. The lay investiture, or the conquering of the worms, was the most important conflict between secular and religious powers in medieval Europe. It began as a dispute in the 11th century between the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV and Pope Gregory VII. The question was who could control appointments of bishops. This controversy led to many years of bitterness and nearly 50 years of civil war in Germany. The war was finally ended with the triumph of the Concordat of Worms Agreement. In it, they agreed that the Church had the sole power to elect and invest bishops with spiritual authority. The emperor, however, had the right to invest them with fiefs. The medieval Christian church was dedicated to the worship of God. At the same time, Christians believed that all people were sinners and that many were doomed to eternal suffering. The only way to avoid the tortures of hell was to believe in Christ and participate in the sacraments. Because the medieval church administered the sacraments, it had absolute power in religious matters. The medieval church developed its own body of laws known as canon law, as well as its own courts. Canon law applied to religious teachings, the clergy, marriages, and morals. Anyone who disobeyed church law faced a wide range of penalties. The most severe and terrifying was excommunication. If excommunicated, people could no longer receive the sacraments or have a Christian burial. The belief was that withholding the sacraments could prevent a person from entering heaven upon death. Also, if excommunicated, no Christian could talk to them or give them food. Nobody could rent them a place to live or in any way have anything to do with them. Even their parents and their wife and children were not supposed to talk to them or let them in their house. In places where most people were Christians, as in the Middle Ages in Europe, this could be life-threatening for ordinary people. All of a sudden, they might be homeless and poor, and even for kings, it was very inconvenient. The excommunication of Robert the Pious. He was the king of the Franks in 996 until his death. He was excommunicated by the Pope for marrying his cousin. A powerful noble who opposed the church could face the interdict, an order excluding an entire town, region, or kingdom from receiving most of the sacraments and Christian burial. Even the strongest ruler gave in rather than face the interdict.